Welcome back to She's Evolving. I'm Elena, a medical doctor specializing in endocrinology. I spend my days looking at blood work, hormones, and the physical architecture of longevity. But today, we're stepping away from the charts and the clinical data for a moment. Today, we're talking about the things that keep us up at 3 a.m. We're talking about the silent whispers of the heart, the fears that we often feel ashamed to voice out loud. We're talking about the transition into the second half of our lives.
And I'm Julia, a clinical psychologist. My work is usually centered on the landscape of the mind, the way we process identity, relationships, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Today's topic is one that comes up in almost every session I have with women our age, yet it's rarely the first thing they say when they sit on my sofa. It's the fear of aging, the fear of ending up alone, the anxiety of a body that feels less like a home and more like a stranger, and the terrifying prospect of starting over when the world tells us we should be settling down. We called this episode Talking About Real Fears Without Judgment, because honestly, society judges us enough. If you're feeling a bit lost, or if you've looked in the mirror recently and felt a pang of, who is this person? This episode is for you. We want to invite you to stay with us, perhaps grab a tea or take us on your walk, and let's peel back the layers of these very human experiences. If you find value in what we discussed today, please do subscribe and share this with a friend. We're building a community where evolution is celebrated, not feared.
Elena, I want to start with something personal. Last week, I was sitting in my living room. My kids are out, the house was quiet, beautifully quiet, I thought at first. But then, this sudden, cold wave of panic hit me. I looked at the empty chairs and thought, is this it? Is the rest of my life just going to be this silence? It wasn't just about the kids. It was about the realization that my role as I knew it had shifted. I felt disposable. Does that make sense from a medical perspective, or am I just overanalyzing my own psyche again?
It makes perfect sense, Julia, and I'll tell you why. But first, I have to admit, I've been there too. For me, it wasn't silence. It was a physical betrayal. I remember being at a medical conference, standing on a stage, and suddenly feeling this heat. Not just a regular, it's warm in here heat, but a volcanic surge. My heart started racing, my brain went foggy, and in that moment, I didn't feel like a high-level endocrinologist. I felt fragile. I felt old. I looked at the younger doctors in the front row and thought, I'm becoming irrelevant. My body is failing the person I think I am. That word, irrelevant, is so heavy. It's the fear that our value is tied to our utility or our youthful appearance. When we talk about the fear of being alone, it's often tied to that. We worry that if we aren't needed in the traditional sense, as mothers, as young romantic interests, as high-energy workers, we will simply fade into the background. Exactly. And as a doctor, I see how this fear of fading manifests as a fear of illness. Women come into my office not just worried about a specific symptom, but worried about the implications of the symptom. They think, if I get sick now, who will take care of me? Will I be a burden? It's a fear of losing autonomy. We've spent our lives being the caretakers, the ones who hold the world together. The idea of being the one who needs the care is terrifying. It's a shift in the power dynamic of our own lives. We've been the pillars. If the pillar starts to crack, what happens to the roof? And because we live in a culture that doesn't value the cracks, the wisdom that comes with those cracks, we feel we have to hide them. We judge ourselves for being afraid. We tell ourselves we should be graceful. But grace is hard when you're worried about your bone density and your retirement fund at the same time. Let's talk about that cracking for a second, because there is a biological reason why we feel more vulnerable. When we hit our late 40s and early 50s, our estrogen levels don't just dip, they fluctuate wildly before dropping significantly. Estrogen is a master regulator. It's in our brains, our hearts, our bones, and our skin. When it leaves the building, the nervous system becomes more sensitive. That explains so much. I tell my patients that their emotional skin feels thinner. Things that didn't bother them 10 years ago suddenly feel like an existential crisis. It's not just in your head, is it? Not at all. It's in your receptors. Lower estrogen can lead to increased cortisol sensitivity. So that feeling of existential dread Julia mentioned, that's partly your brain trying to recalibrate to a new hormonal environment. You aren't going crazy and you aren't weak. You are undergoing a massive physiological restructuring. Think of it like a house being renovated while you're still living in it. The wires are exposed, the water is turned off, and it's dusty and uncomfortable. But the goal is a more efficient, updated structure.
I love that metaphor, but the dust is what scares people. In my practice, the fear of changing often manifests as a fear of losing one's identity. Women ask me, if I'm not the pretty one, or the busy one, or the productive mother, then who am I? We've spent decades building a persona based on external validation. When the physical body changes, when the skin loses elasticity, when the weight redistributes, it feels like the foundation of that persona is crumbling.
And the medical industry doesn't always help. We tend to pathologize aging. We treat it like a disease to be cured rather than a stage to be managed. I see women who are terrified of every new ache because they think it's the beginning of the end. I have to remind them, aging is a privilege denied to many. But to enjoy that privilege, we have to address the fear of illness with facts, not just anxiety. Facts like what? Give us some grounding, Elena. For example, the fear of getting sick and being alone. Statistically, women are very resilient, but we have to be proactive. Taking care of your muscle mass now through resistance training isn't just about looking good in a sleeveless dress. It's about being able to carry your own groceries when you're 80. It's about metabolic health. When we take control of what we can control, the fear of the unknown becomes a plan for the known. That's empowering. It's moving from a passive victim of time to an active participant in your own evolution. But what about the fear of being alone in a romantic or social sense? I hear so many women say, if I divorce now or if my partner passes, I'll never find anyone else. No one wants a woman over 50. That's one of the biggest myths we need to bust right now.
Absolutely. The invisible woman syndrome is real, but only if we buy into the idea that our visibility depends on the male gaze or youthful standards. I've seen women in their 50s and 60s start the most vibrant, honest, and passionate relationships of their lives. Why? Because they finally know who they are. They aren't performing anymore. They aren't trying to catch someone. They are looking for a companion to walk beside them. And let's talk about the libido myth. People think that once you hit menopause, your sex life is over. That's medically false. Yes, the physiology changes. Yes, you might need some help, whether that's hormone replacement therapy, localized treatments, or just more time and communication. But the capacity for pleasure doesn't have an expiration date. In fact, for many women, the end of the fear of pregnancy and the increase in self-knowledge leads to a much more fulfilling intimate life. It's about re-signification. We have to redefine what sexy is, what healthy is, and what success is. If we use the metrics of a 20-year-old, we will always fail. But if we use the metrics of a 50-year-old, wisdom, emotional depth, resilience, authenticity, then we are winning. Let's dive into some of the questions we received from our listeners because they touch on these very points. One listener, Sarah, wrote, I'm 54, recently single, and I'm terrified of getting a serious illness and having no one to call. How do I stop this thought from paralyzing me? Sarah, that fear is so valid. It's a primal fear, the fear of being outside the tribe. My advice to Sarah is to look at the tribe differently. We often think the only person who can care for us is a romantic partner or a child. But this is the age of chosen family. Now is the time to invest deeply in your friendships. Build a network of women who look out for each other. I call it the village. When we have a village, the fear of being alone diminishes because we realize we are part of a collective. And from a practical standpoint, Sarah, I would say knowledge is the antidote to fear. Do your checkups, know your numbers, blood pressure, cholesterol, bone density. When you have a clear picture of your health, you aren't fighting a ghost in the dark. You're managing a reality. And often, that reality is much better than the nightmare your anxiety is dreaming up. We also had a question for Maria. I feel like I'm mourning the woman I used to be. Is it normal to feel sad about aging, even if I'm healthy? Oh, Maria, I feel this in my soul. I remember looking at a photo of myself from 15 years ago and feeling a genuine sense of grief. It wasn't just about the lack of wrinkles, it was about the possibility I felt back then. Grief is the perfect word, Elena. We are mourning a version of ourselves,
And in psychology, we know that you can't move to the next stage of life until you've properly grieved the one you're leaving. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to miss your 30-year-old metabolism or your 20-year-old skin. But don't let the grief turn into a permanent residence. Use it as a bridge. You are losing youth, but you are gaining substance. A diamond is just coal that handled pressure exceptionally well. You are becoming the diamond.
I often tell my patients that the second half of life is about editing. The first half is about accumulating degrees, kids, houses, stuff, expectations. The second half is about stripping away what no longer serves us. That includes the fear of judgment. Imagine the freedom of not caring if people find you attractive in the conventional sense, and instead caring if you find yourself fascinating. That's the shift. Being fascinating to yourself. I've started taking up things I was too busy for before. I started painting. I'm terrible at it, but my body doesn't care. My brain is firing in new ways. That's part of not getting sick, keeping the brain plastic and engaged. And that brings us to the fear of changing careers, changing habits, changing our minds. Society tells us that by 50 we should be set, but that's a trap. If you aren't changing, you aren't growing. And if you aren't growing, that's when the aging feels like a decline. We see women starting businesses at 55, running marathons at 60, and learning new languages at 70. The change is where the life is. As we start to wrap up today's conversation, I want to leave you with a thought. Fear is just a story about the future that hasn't happened yet. We can spend our energy writing horror stories about loneliness and illness, or we can spend it writing an adventure story about evolution and resilience. Your body is changing, yes, it's a fact of biology, but change isn't a synonym for worse, it's just different. You are entering a phase of life where you can finally be the most authentic version of yourself. You have the experience, you have the wisdom, and you have us. You aren't alone in these fears. Every woman you see at the grocery store, at the office, or in the car next to you is likely carrying some version of the same anxiety. When we talk about it, the fear loses its power. So let's take the power back. Take a deep breath, feel the strength in your body, right now, as it is. It has carried you through decades. It has survived heartbreaks, illnesses, and stress. It is a miracle in progress. Thank you for joining us today on She's Evolving. This conversation is just the beginning. If this episode resonated with you, please share it. Send it to that friend who needs to hear that she's not fading. She's just getting started. We'll be back next week to talk about the invisible woman phenomenon and how to reclaim your space in a world that often looks past us. Until then, remember, you aren't just aging. You are evolving. See you next time. Be kind to yourself. You're doing better than you think. You know, Julia, what you just said about the fear of the invisible woman really strikes a chord. It's not just about how the world sees us, but how we see ourselves when the reflection in the mirror starts to shift. And that leads us to one of the deepest, most whispered fears in our community, the fear of ending up alone. We spend so much of our lives being the glue, holding families together, managing careers, being the point of reference for everyone else. But what happens when the kids leave? What happens if a partner passes away or a long-term relationship dissolves after 25 years? There is this haunting myth that a woman's social and romantic value has an expiration date, and that once you cross it, you are destined for a life of solitude.
It's a terrifying thought for many, Elena, because as humans, we are hardwired for connection. But I want to challenge the way we look at solitude versus loneliness. In my practice, I see so many women who are surrounded by people, husbands, children, colleagues, and yet they feel utterly alone because they aren't being seen for who they are now. They are being seen for the roles they play. When we talk about the fear of being alone as we age, we're often talking about the fear of not being needed anymore. But this is actually a profound opportunity for a second adolescence, if you will. It's the first time in decades many women can ask, "What do I want?" without checking a family calendar first. That's a beautiful way to reframe it. But let's get real for a second. There's also the physical fear tied to that solitude. Who will take care of me if I get sick? What if I fall? As a doctor, I see this anxiety manifesting as hypervigilance over every little ache or pain. women start to view their bodies not as a vessel for life, but as a ticking time bomb of potential dependency. We need to talk about health not as a pursuit of perfection or anti-aging, but as building a foundation of resilience. Longevity isn't just about living a long time. It's about being functional and independent for as long as possible. And that starts with taking the power back from the fear of illness. Exactly. We often treat illness as a moral failure. Like if we just ate enough kale or did enough yoga, we'd be immortal. So when a health scare happens, it's accompanied by this crushing weight of, what did I do wrong? We need to remove the judgment from the aging process. Sickness is a part of the human experience, not a punishment, and the fear of it often stems from the fear of losing control. Elena, from a medical perspective, how do we start to make peace with a body that is inevitably changing without feeling like we're just waiting for something to go wrong?
It starts with data and ends with grace. I tell my patients that we have to be proactive, not reactive. Understanding your hormones, your bone density, and your cardiovascular health isn't about looking for problems. It's about knowing your baseline so you can move through the world with confidence. But the grace part is even more important. It's about acknowledging that your body at 55 is not broken because it doesn't recover like it did at 25. It's just different. It requires a different kind of fuel, a different kind of movement, and a lot more patience. And that brings us to the theme of change, the big, scary C word. Moving house, changing careers, or even the change in our social status as we age. We live in a culture that worships consistency and youth. When things change, we feel like we're losing ground. But think about nature. Nothing stays the same. The most beautiful landscapes are the ones that have been weathered and shaped by the elements over time. Why don't we see ourselves that way? Why do we see a wrinkle as a flaw rather than a map of every time we've laughed or survived a hardship?
It's the myth of the peak, isn't it? The idea that we hit our peak at 30 and it's all downhill from there. I want to shatter that right now. In many ways, I feel more powerful now than I ever did in my 30s. I have more boundaries, more self-knowledge, and frankly, I care a lot less about what people think of me. That is a superpower that only comes with time.
It really is. Let's dive into some of the questions we've received from our listeners because they touch on these exact points. Here's one from Sarah. I'm 54, recently divorced, and I feel like I'm starting from zero. Is it too late to find love or a new purpose?
Sarah, thank you for being so honest. My immediate reaction as a physician who works with women in this transition is, you aren't starting from zero. You are starting from experience. Your hard drive is full of wisdom that you didn't have at 20. Biologically, your body is entering a phase where once the hormonal fluctuations of perimenopause settle, many women report a surge of postmenopausal zest. It's a real thing. Your brain literally rewires itself to be more focused on your own goals rather than just the nurturing of others.
And from a psychological standpoint, Sarah, the idea of finding love often feels daunting because we're using an old template. You aren't looking for someone to build a life from scratch with. You're looking for a partner to share a life with. That's a much more grounded, authentic kind of love. And as for purpose, some of the most successful entrepreneurs and artists didn't find their true calling until their 50s or 60s. The only thing making it too late is the narrative you're telling yourself.
We also have a question from Maria who says, I'm terrified of losing my memory and my sharp mind. My mother had dementia, and every time I forget my keys, I panic.
That's such a common and valid fear, Maria. When we've witnessed the decline of a loved one, every lapse in memory feels like a harbinger of doom. It's that hypervigilance we were talking about earlier. Elena, what's the medical reality of brain fog versus something more serious?
This is so important. First, Maria, brain fog during the menopausal transition is incredibly common and usually linked to the drop of estrogen, which affects the brain's metabolic rate. It is rarely a sign of early onset dementia. It's often a sign of sleep deprivation, stress, or hormonal shifts. We can manage those things. We can improve sleep hygiene, look at HRT options, and focus on neuroprotective habits like Mediterranean-style eating and learning new skills. The panic you feel actually makes the forgetfulness worse because cortisol, the stress hormone, is a disaster for short-term memory. So the first step is to breathe. You are not your mother's diagnosis. You are a different person living in a different time with different tools available to you.
I love that.
You are not your mother's diagnosis. That applies to so many things: our relationships, our health, our fears. We are allowed to break the cycle. We are allowed to age differently than the generations before us. As we start to wrap up this conversation, I want to touch on the idea of community again. We talked about the fear of being alone, but the antidote to that isn't necessarily a romantic partner. It's a tribe. It's having women like Julia in your life who you can call and say, "I'm feeling invisible today," and have them remind you of your light.
Exactly. Loneliness thrives in silence and judgment. When we speak our fears out loud, without judgment, they lose their power over us. We realize that the woman sitting next to us at the coffee shop or the woman in the cubicle across from us is carrying the exact same heavy bag of what-ifs. When we share the load, it gets lighter.
To every woman listening, if you're feeling the weight of these fears, aging, illness, loneliness, please know that they don't define your future. They are just feelings, and feelings are like the weather. They change. Your value is not tied to your utility, your fertility, or your appearance. You are evolving, and evolution is a process of becoming something more, not something less. You are the architect of this next chapter. It might look different than you imagined, and that's okay. Different can be beautiful. Different can be liberating. If you found comfort in today's talk, please share this episode with a friend. Let's start these conversations in our own circles. Let's make it normal to talk about our fears so we can move through them together. Thank you for being part of the She's Evolving community. Remember, your body is your home, and it's okay if the decor changes over the years. It's still a place of strength and beauty. We'll be back next week to continue exploring what it means to live fully and authentically at every age. Until then, be kind to yourself. You're doing better than you think. Stay curious, stay bold, and keep evolving. We'll see you in the next episode.